The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, launched a campaign recently highlighting violence against women and girls with the caption, "This is not okay." And many people are supporting that campaign because there is a problem in London with that issue. And not just in London, elsewhere, but of course, Khan only has jurisdiction in London. Um, and it's ignited a bit of a debate in the Metro, but also in the context of the allegations against Greg Wallace. Now, before I get into this, I'm going to read out a few comments which are quite revealing. Um, I'll put my cards on the table. I do feel that it's important for decent men to speak out, and I try to do that. I've been very vocal about Conor McGregor. I've recently been very vocal about the fact that women who are brave enough to make accusations against powerful men do face a very real backlash, and that's utterly wrong. It's disgusting from men, but also from other women. They're called attention seekers. They're accused of just being out for money. They're asked why now when that answer is obvious. Why now is because when they do come forward previously, they're dismissed. I've been very vocal in defence of women in that position. And I do think there is such a thing as toxic masculinity. I do think there's such a problem as within male culture of banter getting out of hand, for example. Um, like I said with the Greg Wallace situation, I don't know all the details. I'm not there. But if he is constantly making lewd, sexist jokes, sexually implicit jokes, why the hell should women just laugh along with it to show that they have a sense of banter? It's not an obligation for other people to find something funny, in my view. So I do think there's a bit of a regressive attitude there, just expecting people to be in on the banter. If a woman's uncomfortable with sexual innuendo, she's every right to be uncomfortable. Um, and I think a man in that situation needs to stop running his mouth freely and just get hints, have some respect. Doesn't make that man a rapist, but it's insensitive. Um, so that's something that I've been very vocal about. I've been very honest about this. This expression, not all men, is often used defensively by men as pushback against what they perceive to be feminist, vilifying all men. Um, Me Too, I do think in some ways it went too far because I think there were aspects of it that were conflating basically flirtation with sexual harassment. And I do think that there were some aspects of it that went too far. Nevertheless, I think there were other parts of it that were absolutely necessary to call out this sort of culture that I've mentioned. Um, but this battle of the sexes is very, very tiring because, on one hand, women sort of demand and insist that men speak up, and I agree with that. Men should speak up. It's not good enough to just say, well, I'm not a rapist, so it's fine, I'll just be quiet. I do think there is an onus on men to condemn bad men, men who abuse women. That's why I was very angry with the attitudes around Conor McGregor, the number of men and some women, frankly, that were defending him. I just thought that was toxic. So I do think there's a responsibility for men to speak up. Having said that, feminists and other campaigners and these sort of things do need to understand if they're talking in a generalized way about men, it will polarize people. Um, anyway, I'm just going to read out these comments um, because they're quite illuminating. Paul from London is against using the term male violence when talking about assault by men against women. He says doing so alienates the majority of men who are innocent and supporters of the cause. It's a shame Paul seems more offended about it being called male violence than the fact that women and girls are getting murdered. The statistics are readily available for the public, and it's a shame that the majority of those deaths are at the hands of men. It's not all men, but it's almost always a man. That's Angelica in Birmingham. If I didn't say, this is from the Metro last week of an ongoing exchange. Um, and Paul from London actually responded to that the following day. I wish people like Angelica would stop putting words into other people's mouths. Responding to my argument that branding violence against women and girls as male violence alienates innocent men. She said, I'd say more offended about that than the fact women and girls are getting murdered. I no more said that than she said she hated men. A majority of these may be at the hands of men, but it's a minority of men. If you want continued support, make it clear who you're blaming. Would you prefer it if we blamed all women for what a few women do? That's Paul's response. Here's the thing. This is what I would say to Paul. You're probably not a rapist or a guy that beats women, but you said if you want continued support. That's not really a helpful statement because you're taking issue with the perceived generalization. Now, I get that. As a man, I don't like generalizations of men either. But talking about male violence against women in a specific way, I don't think it is condemning all men. I really don't think that's the case because there is a specific problem um, there. I mean, yes, you occasionally get other women who are violent towards women, but it's minimal compared to. I mean, how often do you hear, for example, about a woman being killed by another woman? Extremely low compared to a woman being killed by a husband or a boyfriend. Much, much higher. That's just reality. Um, I mean, how often do you hear about a female mugger killing a woman? It will happen occasionally, but it's just not as common. It's just not. That isn't, as men, we need to just recognize that. So, what I would say to Paul is you're talking about if you want support, that's, yeah, that's kind of missing the point. And that's what other comments were saying in response to that. However, um, Fumi in West Sussex makes an interesting point. I don't know if Fumi is a man or a woman, that name, I'm not sure. It is an interesting point. Angelica says most of the women murdered were at the hands of men. However, we should not forget a majority of homicide victims are men too. According to the Office for National Statistics, in the year ending March 2023, around 7 in 10 victims were male. Given this fact, when London Mayor Sadiq Khan talks about an epidemic of violence against women and pledges to target abusers who make women feel safe, he should be talking about making everybody feel safe. It's not good to create conflict between men and women while everyone has a right to feel safe wherever you are. Well, I completely agree with Fumi. That's a very reasonable point. And I wonder why anyone would have issue with that point. He's not saying the same thing that Paul said. He's not saying that there is no problem. He's saying that actually the statistics show most victims of homicides are men. Most perpetrators are probably men as well. Well, they are. But I do feel that by only focusing on women and girls in terms of violence, yeah, male victims just get thrown. They're seen as expendable. Now, men probably don't face anywhere near the level of sexual harassment that women do. But violence and intimidation isn't just in the form of sexual harassment, serious as that is. I mean, you know, uh, the number of men that will get assaulted more often than not. But I think society does take an action. I think the police in society take this action. Well, it's just two blokes having a fight. Um, if a man assaults a woman, that's a terrible thing. It's awful. Find the thug, arrest him. If a man assaults another man, people may condemn it, but nowhere near as forcefully. There is double standards there. There's absolutely double standards when it comes to male victims of violence. No question about it. No question about it. And it is true that the men who are being attacked are being attacked mostly by other men. You do very, very occasionally get a situation where you get a violent woman, and you do get female domestic abusers as well. That shouldn't be forgotten. Um, in a few cases, it's been horrendous. I read about one young guy that got acid thrown in his face by his girlfriend, and she got a lengthy prison sentence. Having said that, this shouldn't be sort of a whataboutery thing, because honestly, there are far more examples of violent men than violent women. That's just the reality. There are violent women out there, but they're not. It's just not on the same scale. It's just not. If you take all the murder victims in Britain, um, I'm not going to, make a guess, but I'd be comfortable in saying that a substantial majority will of murderers in this country will be men. There'll be some women, of course there will. You know, some women do awful things. That's why I think the feminist narrative of, women in prison. No, I'm sorry. If a woman commits the same crime as a man, she should get the same sentence. I don't agree with the sexist notion that women should get special treatment when it comes to justice. Um, but regarding this debate, not all men, honestly, maybe we men can be a bit defensive sometimes because recognizing that there is a problem, recognizing that the majority of perpetrators are men, isn't the same as saying all men. And I guess if your first response to this subject is to get really defensive and say, oh, well, I'm not a rapist, so don't, you know, unless someone's directly accusing you of being that, then it isn't really necessary to get that defensive. I mean, you don't speak for all men. You don't have to speak for all men. You don't have to speak for rapists. But I do think it's reasonable to condemn them, so it's not good enough to just say, well, it's not me, so it doesn't matter. I mean, if you have a sister, if you have a mother, if you have a girlfriend, if you have female friends, do you not care about them? So expecting men to speak out, I think, is fair enough. Um, I will say, though, I've said this before, I do think that casual misandry gets overlooked in our society. I think female journalists can make sweeping statements about men and they basically get a green light to do it. No male journalist would get away with that, making a comment just berating men. And I'm not talking here about serious things like rape and sexual assault. I saw an article a while back. The columnist was basically whining about supposedly men taking over pavement space. Now, this is just clutching at straws. When people are in a busy pavement in an urban area, I absolutely don't see this idea of men taking over. Um, Also, terms like manspreading or mansplaining is fundamentally sexist. It is. So, I will call out that sort of sexist language. I do think the term mansplaining is very sexist because it's basically saying, you disagree with me, you're a man, so it's mansplaining. Well, if a woman disagrees with you, are you going to say it's womansplaining? It's kind of this idea, oh, he's talking down to me because I'm a woman. Well, I would say, well, you're effectively trying to silence him by saying he's a man and he's talking, so it must be, you know, it's a very cynical way, I think, of shutting down debate. Um, so I don't like that term mansplaining. I will call out misandry as I see it. But I looked at the attitudes around Conor McGregor, I looked at the attitudes around Greg Wallace, and it is true, a lot of men frankly defend it. We don't have a situation where there are loads of men vocally condemning violent men. I think most blokes will be decent. Most blokes will say, yeah, it's awful, terrible thing. But maybe we should be a little bit more vocal. I try to be. Now, any feminist will generally, you know, genuinely say all men are this or all men are that. I will call them out for their misandry. I think they need to be called out for that. But just recognizing that most perpetrators are men and that most violence is committed by men isn't the same as saying all men are the problem. It's just recognizing that that is a fact. So, yeah, maybe I mean, men need to be a little bit less defensive in this regard and not take it personally because just because you're a man doesn't mean that when women complain about men doing this, they're not talking about you personally. Um, I will call out misandrist double standards as I see them, but I'm not. I just think this is one where, as men, we need to be honest. There is a problem. Having said that, I think the mayor should be trying to make all Londoners feel safe. I mean, if a guy gets mugged on the London Underground, shouldn't he have a right to feel safe? If a man gets assaulted by drunken yobs, shouldn't he have a right to feel safe? You know, um, so I do think it is divisive to only focus on one type of victim. I think it's very important to make women and girls feel safe, and I'm not against it in principle, but making it exclusive does, by definition, disregard other victims, i.e., men. The mayor should be focusing on making all Londoners feel safe. I honestly struggle to understand how he got a fair term. I don't think he's a great mayor at all. I do think he's a divisive figure. Um, but that's for Londoners to decide. It's a no-brainer. All Londoners should feel safe. And why shouldn't men say that? Why should men just be silent in terms of why shouldn't men have a right to feel as safe as, the focus on women? It's true that men won't get the same level of sexual harassment, but men could be violently assaulted just as much, if not more. And the statistics show that more men are murdered than women. So that's, murder is a pretty serious crime. It's one of the absolute worst. So I do think there is still a problem in Western society of what I would call the expendable male narrative. This idea that if women and children, well, children's a bit different, they've got the rest of their life ahead of them. Women, you'll see a situation whereby the victims included women. Well, that means the other victims were men. Why are they less important? I do think there's double standards in that regard. Anyway, that's my take on it. Let me know your thoughts.